Picture this. You're standing outside Buckingham Palace on a drizzly London morning, watching the famous guards in their towering black hats and bright red uniforms. They stand perfectly still, like living statues, trained never to react, never to smile, never to break character. For decades, tourists have tried everything to make them flinch. Silly jokes, outrageous costumes, even marriage proposals right in front of them. Nothing works. They're unbreakable. But what if I told you that behind those stoic faces and rigid postures lies something far more beautiful than any military precision? What if the most powerful moments in royal history weren't the grand ceremonies or state dinners, but the split seconds when these guardians of tradition chose compassion over protocol? This isn't a story about rules being broken. It's about humanity being found. In a world that often feels cold and divided, where people seem more disconnected than ever, there's something magical that happens when we witness unexpected kindness. When someone in a position of absolute authority chooses gentleness instead. When duty meets heart, and heart wins. These are the moments that remind us why we're all here together. The moments that prove that beneath every uniform, every title, every carefully constructed role, there's a human being capable of extraordinary grace. And sometimes, just sometimes, those moments happen when royal guards can't and shouldn't keep a straight face. Get ready to discover the most uplifting stories you've never heard, where the world's most disciplined soldiers became the world's most compassionate heroes. The morning of June 15th, 2019, started like any other outside the gates of Buckingham Palace. Tourists gathered in small clusters, cameras ready, hoping to catch a glimpse of something exciting. The changing of the guard ceremony was still an hour away, but the anticipation was already building. Among the crowd stood the Henderson family from Ohio, on their first trip to London, with 4-year-old Emma clutching her favorite stuffed rabbit named Mr. Hoppy. Emma had been talking about meeting a real princess for weeks. Her parents had gently explained that they might not actually see the Queen, but Emma's imagination had already painted vivid pictures of waving to royalty from behind the palace gates. She wore her best pink dress, the one that made her feel like a princess herself, and had insisted on bringing Mr. Hoppy because princesses always have animal friends. Standing at attention near the main gate was Guardsman James Mitchell, a veteran of 12 years with the Grenadier Guards. At 6 feet 4 inches tall, with his distinctive bearskin hat adding another 18 inches to his height, he was an imposing figure. James had served 2 tours in Afghanistan, had stood guard during state visits from world leaders, and had never once broken protocol. His record was spotless, his discipline legendary among his peers. But James was also a father. At home in a small flat in South London, photos covered his refrigerator showing his own daughter, Sophie, who had just turned 5. Every morning before reporting for duty, he would kiss her forehead and promise to come home safely. Every evening, she would ask him about his day, wide-eyed with wonder at her daddy's important job protecting the Queen. The crowd grew larger as the ceremony time approached. Emma pressed against the ornate iron railings, standing on her tiptoes to get a better view. Her parents were busy consulting their guidebook and taking photos, trusting that their well-behaved daughter would stay close. But Emma's attention was entirely focused on the tall guard who seemed to tower over everyone like a gentle giant from her fairy tale books. What happened next would later be described by witnesses as both heartbreaking and beautiful. A group of rowdy teenagers, pushing through the crowd to get closer to the gates, accidentally knocked into Emma. She stumbled forward, her hands slipping from the railings, and Mr. Hoppy flew from her grasp. The beloved stuffed rabbit landed in the narrow space between the crowd and the guard post, just out of everyone's reach. Emma's cry of distress cut through the morning air like a siren. "Mr. Hoppy! Someone help Mr. Hoppy!" She tried to squeeze between the railings, her small arms stretching desperately toward her fallen friend. Her parents rushed to comfort her, but Emma was inconsolable. The tears came in great, shuddering sobs that spoke of a 4-year-old's broken heart. The The crowd around them grew awkward and silent. People looked at the stuffed rabbit, then at the immovable guard, then back at the crying child. Everyone understood the situation, but no one knew what to do. The rabbit was clearly beyond the reach of the crowd, and everyone knew that the Queen's guards never, ever broke their stance. It was simply impossible. James heard every sob. Standing perfectly still, eyes fixed straight ahead, he was nevertheless acutely aware of the little girl's distress. In his peripheral vision, he could see the pink dress, the tiny hands wiping at tears, the way she kept looking up at him with hope and desperation. It was the same look his daughter Sophie gave him when she needed her daddy to fix something that seemed unfixable. For 10 minutes, the scene continued. Emma's parents tried everything they could think of, asking palace staff, looking for tools to retrieve the rabbit, even considering whether they could buy an identical replacement somewhere nearby. But Emma wasn't interested in solutions. She wanted Mr. Hoppy back, and she seemed to understand instinctively that the tall guard was the only one who could help. Other guards had noticed the situation too. Through their subtle communication system of almost imperceptible glances and slight head movements, they were discussing what could be done. The rules were clear. Maintain position. Eyes forward. No interaction with the public except in cases of immediate danger or security threats. A lost stuffed animal, however heartbreaking, didn't qualify as an emergency. But James was thinking about more than rules. He was thinking about the promise he made to his daughter every morning. He was thinking about the oath he took as a guard, which wasn't just about protecting buildings and ceremonies. It was about serving and protecting all subjects of the crown, even the smallest and most vulnerable ones. He was thinking about what kind of man he wanted to be when he went home that evening. The breakthrough came when Emma stopped crying long enough to look directly up at James. In a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "Please, Mr. Guard. Mr. Hoppy is scared without me." The simple, trusting way she looked at him, as if he truly could solve any problem, as if his uniform meant he was there to help people like her. It changed everything. James made a decision that would echo through social media and news outlets around the world within hours. Slowly, maintaining his military bearing, but allowing the smallest softening around his eyes, he looked down at Emma. Then, in one fluid motion, he stepped forward, bent down with perfect military precision, and picked up Mr. Hoppy. The crowd held its breath. Here was a Queen's Guard, trained to be as unmovable as stone, actively choosing to break protocol for a crying child. But James wasn't done. Instead of simply handing the rabbit back through the railings, he did something that witnesses would remember for years to come. He stood at attention, holding Mr. Hoppy at the perfect angle for Emma to see, and gave the stuffed rabbit a formal military inspection. He checked its ears, smoothed its fur, and even appeared to whisper something to it. Later, Emma would insist he told Mr. Hoppy to be brave like a good soldier. Then, with the same ceremony he would use for an important military honor, he carefully returned the rabbit to its young owner. Emma's face transformed from heartbreak to pure joy in an instant. "Thank you, Mr. Guard. Thank you," she exclaimed, hugging Mr. Hoppy tightly. But the magic wasn't over yet. As James returned to his position, Emma did something that no one expected. She stood up as straight as her 4-year-old frame would allow, brought her small hand to her forehead in the most serious salute she could manage, and said, "I salute you too, Mr. Guard." Without hesitation, James returned her salute with full military precision. For just a moment, they stood there, the towering grenadier guard and the tiny girl in the pink dress, acknowledging each other with a respect and dignity that transcends age, rank, and protocol. The crowd erupted in spontaneous applause, many people wiping away tears of their own. The story could have ended there, and it would have been beautiful. But what happened next proved that acts of kindness create ripples that extend far beyond the moment they occur. Emma's father had managed to capture the entire interaction on his phone, and by the time the family returned to their hotel, the video was already being shared by people who had witnessed the scene. Within 24 hours, the video had been viewed millions of times. Comments poured in from around the world. all expressing the same sentiment. In a time of division and conflict, here was a reminder of fundamental human goodness. The story was picked up by major news outlets, not as a breach of protocol, but as an example of protocol serving its true purpose, protecting and serving the people. The response from the royal household was swift and decisive. Rather than disciplining James for breaking protocol, they issued a statement praising his exemplary demonstration of the values that the Queen's Guard represents: duty, honor, and compassion. The statement went on to note that true discipline includes the wisdom to know when kindness serves a greater purpose than rigidity. But perhaps the most meaningful response came from James's fellow guards. In the days following the incident, several of them privately shared their own stories of small acts of kindness they had performed while on duty. There was the guard who had quietly directed a lost elderly tourist to the nearest restroom, another who had spotted a pickpocket and managed to alert police with subtle hand signals, a third who had called for medical help when he noticed a tourist showing signs of heat exhaustion. These stories revealed something profound about the culture within the Queen's Guard that the public rarely saw. Yes, they were trained to be disciplined and unmovable, but they were also trained to be observant and protective. The best guards, it turned out, were those who understood that their ultimate duty was to people, not just to positions. James received hundreds of letters from around the world, many from parents thanking him for showing their own children what kindness looks like. He also received a very special letter from Emma herself, written in the careful handwriting of a 4-year-old, with a drawing of him and Mr. Hoppy standing together. The letter simply said, "Thank you for saving my best friend. Love, Emma and Mr. Hoppy." The incident also sparked a broader conversation about the role of tradition and protocol in modern society. Rather than viewing James's actions as a violation of sacred rules, many people began to see them as evidence that the best traditions are those flexible enough to accommodate human compassion. The Queen's Guard, rather than being diminished by this show of humanity, seemed more honorable because of it. For Emma, the experience became the foundation of a lifelong love for England and its people. Her parents reported that she would often tell the story to friends, always emphasizing how the Guard was the nicest, biggest person in the world. She kept Mr. Hoppy with her throughout their London vacation, and the rabbit seemed to carry a bit of extra magic after its rescue by Queen's Guard. The impact on James was equally profound. He found himself more aware of the people around him during his duties, more attuned to moments where a small gesture might make a large difference. He began to see his role not just as a ceremonial position, but as a daily opportunity to represent the best of what service could mean. His interactions with his own daughter deepened too, as he realized that every act of kindness in public was also a lesson in values he was teaching her. Months later, when the Henderson family returned to London for a second visit, they made a point of visiting Buckingham Palace again. Emma wore the same pink dress and brought Mr. Hoppy along. James happened to be on duty that day, and though he maintained his proper military bearing, the slight warmth in his eyes when he spotted the little girl and her rabbit suggested that some connections transcend protocol in the most beautiful possible way. The story of Emma and Mr. Hoppy became more than just a viral video. It became a reminder that in a world that often feels too rigid, too divided, too focused on rules and procedures, there's always room for kindness. It proved that true strength isn't about never bending, but about knowing when to bend in service of something more important than appearances. And it showed that sometimes the most powerful thing a person in uniform can do is remember that beneath that uniform beats the heart of someone who, at the end of the day, just wants to make the world a little bit better for a little girl and her stuffed rabbit named Mr. Hoppy. The November rain fell steadily on the streets of London, creating that particular kind of gray afternoon that seems to seep into your bones. Outside Windsor Castle, the usual crowds of tourists had thinned to just a few dedicated sightseers huddled under umbrellas. The changing of the guard ceremony had been postponed due to weather, but the sentries remained at their posts, as they always did, rain or shine. Among those few brave souls venturing out in the weather was an old man moving slowly along the castle's perimeter. His name was Arthur Pemberton, and at 93 years old, every step was deliberate and careful. He wore a worn brown overcoat that had seen better decades, and clutched a simple wooden walking stick that bore the subtle engravings of military service ribbons. Most passers-by wouldn't have given him a second glance, just another elderly tourist taking his time. But Arthur wasn't just any tourist. Pinned discreetly to his coat lapel was a small medal that told a story most people wouldn't recognize. The Distinguished Conduct Medal, awarded to non-commissioned officers and enlisted men for exceptional bravery in the face of the enemy. Arthur had earned his during the Korean War in 1951, when as a 25-year-old corporal in the Gloucestershire Regiment, he had held a crucial position against overwhelming odds for 18 hours, allowing his unit to evacuate wounded comrades. The guard on duty that afternoon was Lance Corporal Sarah Chun, one of the first women to serve in the prestigious Coldstream Guards. At 26, she represented a new generation of guards, highly trained, deeply committed, and proud to be part of an evolving tradition. Sarah had joined the military straight from university, driven by a family legacy of service that stretched back 3 generations. Her great-grandfather had served in Burma during World War II, her grandfather in the Falklands, and her father had done 2 tours in Iraq. For Sarah, standing guard at Windsor Castle wasn't just a duty. It was the culmination of a family story written in service and sacrifice. Arthur had traveled to Windsor Castle on this dreary November day for a very specific reason. Earlier that week, he had received news that would have broken a lesser man's spirit. The last surviving member of his Korean War unit, his best friend Harold Morrison, had passed away in his sleep. Harold and Arthur had maintained a friendship for over 70 years, built on shared experiences that only fellow soldiers could truly understand. They had written letters weekly, met for lunch monthly, and called each other on every anniversary of their return from Korea. With Harold's passing, Arthur realized he was now the sole keeper of their unit's memory. The thought weighed heavily on him, but it also gave him a sense of purpose. He had decided to make one final pilgrimage to Windsor Castle, to pay his respects not just to the crown they had served, but to all the young men who had never made it home from that distant conflict. Arthur's plan was simple. He wanted to stand quietly near the guards, offer a private salute to fallen comrades, and then head home to begin the difficult process of organizing Harold's military effect for donation to a war museum. It was meant to be a personal, quiet moment of closure. He never expected what would actually happen. As Arthur approached the guard post where Sarah stood at attention, something about his bearing caught her eye. Despite his age and the obvious effort required for each step, there was something unmistakably military about the way he moved. The straightness of his shoulders despite his years, the deliberate precision of his steps, the way he naturally maintained spacing and timing even as a pedestrian. These were details that only someone with military training would notice. Sarah had been taught to observe everything during her duties. Part of her role was security, which meant being aware of everyone in her vicinity. But part of it was also ceremonial, and she had learned to read the stories that visitors brought with them. She could usually identify former military personnel within moments, recognizing the subtle signs of training that never fully fade. Arthur was clearly former military, but something about him suggested his service went deeper than most. When Arthur reached a position about 10 feet from Sarah's post, he stopped. Slowly, with obvious effort but unmistakable dignity, he removed his worn cap and placed it carefully over his heart. Then, despite the rain beginning to soak through his thin coat, he stood perfectly still and brought his free hand to his forehead in a precise military salute. The salute itself was a masterpiece of military tradition. His fingers were perfectly aligned, his wrist straight, his elbow at exactly the right angle. Even after 7 decades, Arthur's muscle memory preserved the exact form he had learned as a young recruit. But more than the technical precision, there was something profound in the way he held the position. His eyes were closed, his lips moved silently, and tears mixed with raindrops on his weathered cheeks. Sarah recognized immediately that this wasn't a tourist taking photos or trying to interact with the guards. This was a soldier paying his respects. Every instinct of her training told her to maintain her position, eyes forward, no acknowledgement. But every instinct of her heart told her something entirely different. The seconds stretched into a full minute, then two. Arthur remained motionless in his salute, seemingly oblivious to the rain soaking through his clothes. Other tourists began to notice and stop, sensing that something significant was happening even if they didn't understand what it was. A few raised their phones to take pictures, but something about the solemnity of the moment made most of them lower the devices again. Sarah found herself thinking about her great-grandfather's stories from Burma, about the young men who had never come home, about the weight of service and sacrifice that connected generations of soldiers across time and conflict. She thought about her own deployment to Afghanistan 2 years earlier, about the friends she had lost, and the burden of memory that came with survival. In Arthur's silent salute, she saw something universal about the military experience, the way those who serve carry the memory of those who don't return. The decision Sarah made next would later be described by military historians as a perfect example of how true discipline sometimes requires knowing when to break the rules. Without moving her body or changing her position, she began to shift her eyes toward Arthur. Then, in a moment that witnesses would remember for years to come, she did something unprecedented. While maintaining her guard position, Sarah slowly brought her own hand to her forehead in return salute. She held the position for exactly the same duration as Arthur, matching his precision and solemnity with her own. When Arthur finally lowered his hand and opened his eyes, he found himself looking directly into the face of a young guard who was honoring both him and the memories he carried. The eye contact lasted only a few seconds, but in that brief exchange, something profound passed between them. Arthur saw in Sarah's eyes the same dedication and honor that had motivated his own service 7 decades earlier. Sarah saw in Arthur's eyes the weight of experience, the depth of sacrifice, and the continuation of a tradition that connected her service to something much larger than herself. Arthur's face, already wet with rain and tears, broke into the gentlest smile. He nodded once, almost imperceptibly, in acknowledgement. Sarah, still maintaining her formal position, allowed the slightest softening around her eyes that communicated volumes. Then, Arthur carefully replaced his cap, straightened his shoulders as much as his age would allow, and began his slow journey back along the castle perimeter. But the story was far from over. Unknown to either Arthur or Sarah, several people in the small crowd had witnessed the exchange and understood its significance. Among them was James Whitworth, a military historian who had come to Windsor specifically to research guard protocols for a book he was writing. James understood immediately that he had witnessed something extraordinary, not a breach of protocol, but a transcendence of it. James approached Arthur as the old man made his way slowly back toward the castle gates. "Excuse me, sir," he said gently. "I couldn't help but notice your service medal. Koleanva." Arthur paused, surprised to be recognized. "Gloucestershire Regiment," he replied quietly. "Lost a lot of good lads there." James nodded respectfully. "Would you mind if I walked with you? I'd be honored to hear a bit of your story." As they walked together, Arthur found himself sharing details about his service that he rarely discussed. He talked about Harold, about their unit's final action, about the weight of being the last survivor. James listened with the deep respect of someone who understood the significance of what he was hearing. By the time they reached the castle gates, he had an idea that would change Arthur's life. James was well-connected in military history circles, and within days of meeting Arthur, he had put together something unprecedented. He organized a small ceremony at the Gloucestershire Regiment's museum, specifically to honor Arthur and the memory of his fallen comrades. More importantly, he arranged for Sarah Chun to be there in her dress uniform, to properly return the salute she had given at Windsor. The ceremony was small and private, attended only by military historians, a few active-duty soldiers, and representatives from the regiment's Veterans Association. But its impact was enormous. For Arthur, it provided the recognition and closure he had never received when returning from Korea 70 years earlier. For Sarah, it connected her service to a living link with military history that few soldiers ever experience. During the ceremony, Arthur was invited to speak about his experiences for the first time in decades. His voice was soft but steady as he talked about Harold, about their unit, about the young men who had died so far from home. "We weren't heroes," he said quietly. "We were just boys doing our duty." But Harold always said that as long as someone remembered us, as long as someone carried on the tradition of service, then those lads didn't die for nothing. When it came time for the formal portion of the ceremony, Sarah stepped forward in her pristine dress uniform. Arthur, wearing his old medals with obvious pride, stood as straight as his 93-year-old frame would allow. This time, their exchange of salutes was deliberate, formal, and witnessed by people who understood exactly what it represented. But the most moving moment came when Sarah presented Arthur with something unexpected, a letter from her commanding officer, formally acknowledging his service and expressing gratitude for his dedication to preserving military memory. The letter also announced that Arthur's story would be included in the training curriculum for new guards, as an example of why their service connected them to something larger than ceremony. The impact of Arthur and Sarah's encounter extended far beyond that November day at Windsor Castle. The story, when it eventually became public, sparked a national conversation about how society honors its veterans, particularly those whose service had been overshadowed by larger conflicts. Arthur began receiving letters from veterans of other wars, sharing their own stories of service and sacrifice. More importantly, the encounter changed how both Arthur and Sarah viewed their own roles. Arthur realized that his memories weren't just personal burdens. They were historical treasures that needed to be shared. He began speaking at schools and military events, ensuring that the stories of Harold and their fallen comrades would live on in new generations. Sarah's perspective on her guard duties deepened significantly. She began to see each day of service not just as professional responsibility, but as participation in an unbroken chain of military tradition that stretched back through Arthur to countless soldiers throughout history. Her approach to encounters with veterans became more aware, more respectful, and more connected to the deeper meaning of her role. The story also highlighted something beautiful about human connection across generations. Despite being separated by 7 decades of age and vastly different military experiences, Arthur and Sarah had found common ground in shared values of service, honor, and remembrance. Their brief exchange at Windsor Castle proved that these values transcend time, gender, conflict, and rank. Years later, Arthur would often tell people that the encounter with Sarah had given him something precious. The knowledge that the tradition of service he had devoted his life to was in good hands. For Sarah, meeting Arthur provided a tangible connection to military history that enriched her understanding of why guard duty mattered beyond ceremony and tourism. The rain continued to fall that November afternoon, but inside Windsor Castle's ancient walls, something timeless had occurred. 2 soldiers, separated by generations, but united by honor, had reminded everyone who witnessed their exchange that true service creates bonds that transcend time, weather, and protocol. In choosing to recognize each other's dignity and sacrifice, they had elevated both their individual service and the noble tradition they shared. And in the end, that's what the best military traditions do. They create space for honor to recognize honor, for service to acknowledge service, and for one generation of defenders to pass their torch to the next with the respect and dignity that such a sacred trust deserves. The morning of September 12th, 2020, dawned crisp and clear over Edinburgh, with the kind of golden autumn light that makes everything look like a painting. The COVID-19 pandemic had changed many things about daily life in Scotland, but one thing remained constant. The ceremonial guards at Edinburgh Castle continued their duties with the same precision and dedication they had shown for centuries. Among them was Sergeant Michael Fraser, a native Scotsman whose grandfather had served in the same regiment during World War II. What made this particular September morning special wasn't the weather or the reduced crowds due to pandemic restrictions. It was the story unfolding in the heart of Edinburgh's Old Town, just a few blocks away from the castle. In a small flat overlooking the Royal Mile, a young couple named David and Christina Mackenzie were preparing for what should have been the happiest day of their lives, their wedding. David was a junior doctor at Edinburgh Royal Infirmary, and Christina worked as a primary school teacher. They had planned their wedding for over 2 years, saving every penny for their dream celebration. The venue was booked, the flowers ordered, the photographer hired, and 120 guests had confirmed their attendance. Christina's dress hung in their tiny bedroom closet, a beautiful creation that represented months of careful shopping and saving. David's grandfather's vintage cufflinks lay ready on the dresser, carrying 3 generations of family tradition. But sometimes life has other plans. 3 days before the wedding, new pandemic restrictions had been announced. Gatherings were limited to 6 people indoors, with no exceptions for previously planned events. In a matter of hours, Christina and David's dream wedding had transformed from a celebration with their entire extended family into an impossible logistical nightmare. The legal ceremony could still proceed with just the minimum required witnesses, but everything else, the reception, the dancing, the toast from beloved grandparents, the celebration they had worked so hard to create, had to be canceled. Their deposit money was gone. Their vendors couldn't refund payments for orders already prepared. And, most heartbreaking of all, Christina's grandmother in Glasgow was in poor health and couldn't travel to Edinburgh for the small ceremony that remained possible. Christina's grandmother, Margaret, was 91 years old and had been more than a grandparent to her. She had been a second mother after Christina lost her parents in a car accident when she was 12. Margaret had raised Christina through her teenage years, working 2 jobs to pay for her education and always promising that she would dance at Christina's wedding. The thought of getting married without her grandmother there was almost unbearable for Christina. As they sat in their flat that Saturday morning, both in their wedding attire with nowhere to go, Christina and David faced a choice. They could postpone the wedding indefinitely, hoping for better times ahead, or they could proceed with the legal ceremony at the registry office and try to find meaning in what felt like a hollow version of their dreams. "Maybe we should just wait," Christina said, looking at herself in the mirror. Her dress was everything she had hoped it would be, but wearing it in their small flat instead of a beautiful venue filled her with sadness rather than joy. This isn't how it was supposed to happen. David, adjusting his grandfather's cufflinks for what might be the last time, felt equally torn. But what if we wait and things don't get better? What if something happens to your grandmother, or my deployment gets moved up? David was scheduled to begin a 6-month medical posting in rural Scotland the following month, and there was talk of international assignments after that. The decision they made next would seem small to most people, but it changed everything for them, and eventually touched the lives of dozens of others. Instead of heading directly to the registry office for their bare minimum ceremony, they decided to take a walk through Edinburgh first. "If we're going to get married today," Christina said, "I want to see the city where we met, where we fell in love, where we built our life together." Dressed in full wedding attire, they stepped out into the Edinburgh morning. Christina in her flowing white dress, David in his formal kilt representing his family's clan. They began walking through the cobblestone streets of the old town. They passed the cafe where they had their first date, the bookshop where David had proposed, the small church where they had hoped to have their ceremony before learning it was closed for renovations. Their walk inevitably led them up the Royal Mile toward Edinburgh Castle. As they climbed the ancient street, other pedestrians began to notice them. Even with pandemic restrictions keeping crowds smaller than usual, there were still people out and about, and a bride and groom walking alone through the historic streets of Edinburgh was impossible to ignore. The first person to approach them was Mrs. Eleanor Sinclair, an elderly woman walking her small terrier. "Are you two heading to your wedding?" she asked kindly. When Christina explained their situation, Mrs. Sinclair's eyes filled with tears. "Well, that simply won't do," she declared. "A couple as lovely as you two deserves better than that." Before they could protest, she had pulled out her phone and begun taking photos. "At least you'll have beautiful pictures in this gorgeous light," she insisted. Word began to spread in the way that only happens in close-knit communities. Mrs. Sinclair mentioned the situation to her neighbor, who told her daughter, who happened to work at a flower shop that had prepared arrangements for a canceled event. Within an hour, a small bouquet had been delivered to Christina on the street, with a note saying every bride deserves flowers on her wedding day. As David and Christina continued their walk, more people began to join their impromptu procession. A street musician started playing romantic Scottish ballads as they passed. A couple celebrating their own anniversary offered to walk with them for good luck. A group of university students, learning about their situation, began singing traditional Scottish wedding songs. By the time they reached the esplanade in front of Edinburgh Castle, what had started as a private walk had become something extraordinary. Nearly 50 people had gathered around them, strangers who had been touched by their story and wanted to be part of their special day. The crowd was diverse. Elderly couples sharing wisdom about marriage, young families with children who were delighted by the real-life fairy tale, tourists who felt honored to witness something so authentic and spontaneous. This is where Sergeant Michael Fraser enters the story. Standing at his post near the castle entrance, he had been watching the unusual gathering with professional curiosity that gradually turned to personal interest. Through the conversations swirling around the couple, he had pieced together their story. As a married man himself, with a wife and 2 young children waiting at home, Michael understood the heartbreak of having special moments diminished by circumstances beyond your control. The crowd around David and Christina was entirely well-meaning, but it was also becoming slightly chaotic. People were taking photos, asking questions, and offering advice all at once. Christina was beginning to feel overwhelmed by the attention, and David was trying to balance gratitude for people's kindness with his desire to protect his bride from stress on their wedding day. Michael made a decision that would be remembered by everyone present as the moment when kindness transcended duty. Stepping away from his formal guard position, he approached the crowd with the kind of natural authority that comes with military training. But instead of dispersing the gathering, he did something completely unexpected. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced in his strong Scottish accent, "if I may have your attention, please." The crowd quieted immediately, responding to his commanding but respectful tone. "We have a young couple here celebrating their wedding day, and I think we can do better than this impromptu gathering. Would you be willing to help me give them a proper Scottish wedding send-off?" What happened next was pure magic. Michael began organizing the crowd with the same precision he would use for a military ceremony, but with a warmth and joy that transformed the gathering into something beautiful. He arranged people in a traditional Scottish wedding formation, with the couple in the center and everyone else creating concentric circles around them. In Scottish tradition, Michael explained to the crowd, a wedding isn't just about 2 people. It's about a community welcoming a new family into their midst. He pulled out his phone and began playing traditional Scottish wedding music. "Now, everyone join hands, and we'll give these 2 a proper Highland wedding circle." The circle that formed around David and Christina was unlike anything they could have imagined. Strangers linked hands with each other and began moving in the traditional steps of a Scottish wedding dance. Mrs. Sinclair, the elderly woman who had taken their first photos, found herself holding hands with a young father, teaching his daughter the steps. University students danced beside elderly tourists, everyone laughing and celebrating together. But Michael wasn't finished. As the dance reached its crescendo, he did something that witnesses still talk about years later. Standing at attention in his full military dress uniform, he offered David and Christina a formal military honor guard salute. Then, maintaining his military bearing, he called out in a voice that carried across the castle esplanade. "Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you Mr. and Mrs. Mackenzie, married this day in the presence of Edinburgh Castle and witnessed by this gathered community." The crowd erupted in cheers and applause. People threw flower petals they had gathered from nearby gardens. Someone produced confetti from their pocket. The street musician played a triumphant Highland reel. And in the center of it all, David and Christina found themselves experiencing something more beautiful than any wedding they could have planned. The celebration continued for nearly an hour, with people sharing stories, offering blessings, and creating an atmosphere of pure joy. Michael remained in his role as unofficial master of ceremonies, ensuring that everyone felt included while keeping the focus on the couple. His natural leadership and genuine warmth transformed what could have been a chaotic gathering into an organized celebration that honored both Scottish tradition and the spontaneous kindness of strangers. As the formal ceremony time at the registry office approached, the crowd began to disperse, but not before something remarkable happened. Mrs. Sinclair approached Christina with tears in her eyes and an old tartan scarf in her hands. "This belonged to my grandmother," she said. "She wore it at her wedding in 1923, and I wore it at mine in 1954. I'd be honored if you'd wear it today for good luck." The street musician presented David with a small wooden button carved with Celtic knots. "My grandfather made this for my father's wedding, and his father made one for his," he explained. "Every Highland groom should have something made by Scottish hands." But perhaps the most touching moment came when Michael approached them as they prepared to leave for the registry office. "I have something for you both," he said, producing an official-looking envelope. Inside was a letter on Edinburgh Castle letterhead, signed by him in his official capacity as a castle guard. The letter formally acknowledged their wedding celebration at the castle and declared them friends of Edinburgh Castle, welcomed into the community of Scotland with honor and joy. The letter wasn't just symbolic. It came with genuine privileges, including annual invitations to castle events and a standing invitation to return for anniversary celebrations. But more than the practical benefits, it represented something profound: the idea that their wedding had been witnessed and blessed by one of Scotland's most historic institutions. The actual legal ceremony at the registry office was brief and simple, but by then, it felt like a formality. David and Christina had already experienced their real wedding on the streets of Edinburgh, surrounded by the spontaneous kindness of strangers and blessed by the genuine warmth of a community that had embraced them as their own. The story didn't end there, however. Photos and videos from their impromptu castle celebration began appearing on social media, shared by the many witnesses who had been touched by the experience. The images showed something beautiful: a community coming together to celebrate love, strangers becoming temporary family, and a uniformed guard choosing humanity over protocol. The response was overwhelming. Messages poured in from around the world, from couples sharing their own pandemic wedding stories, from Scottish expatriates moved by the display of Highland hospitality, and from strangers who were simply touched by the demonstration of human kindness. Several Scottish cultural organizations reached out to invite David and Christina to share their story at events celebrating Scottish tradition and community spirit. But perhaps the most meaningful response came from an unexpected source: Christina's grandmother in Glasgow. Mrs. Sinclair had sent her the photos and videos from the celebration, and Margaret called that evening with tears of joy in her voice. "I may not have been there in person," she told Christina, "but I can see from these pictures that you were surrounded by love. That's all any grandmother could want for her granddaughter." The impact on Michael Fraser was equally significant. His commanding officers, rather than reprimanding him for stepping away from his post, commended him for demonstrating the values that the Scottish regiments were meant to embody: community service, Highland hospitality, and honor. His actions were cited in military publications as an example of how soldiers could serve their communities even while maintaining their professional duties. More personally, the experience changed how Michael approached his work. He began to see his role as a castle guard not just as a security and ceremonial position, but as an opportunity to be an ambassador for Scottish values and traditions. He became known among his colleagues for his ability to connect with visitors, to share historical knowledge, and to represent the best of what Scottish military tradition could offer to the world. For David and Christina, their wedding day became something they treasured far more than any planned celebration could have been. The spontaneous outpouring of kindness from strangers, the way their community had embraced them, and the role that Michael had played in transforming a difficult situation into something magical. All of this created memories that grew more precious with time. They returned to Edinburgh Castle every year on their anniversary, and Michael, when he was on duty, always made time to greet them and ask about their life together. Their story became part of castle lore, shared with visitors as an example of how traditions evolve and grow when they're rooted in genuine human values rather than rigid rules. Years later, when David and Christina had their first child, they received an unexpected package in the mail. Inside was a small tartan blanket and a note from Michael Fraser, for the newest member of the Edinburgh Castle family. May they grow up knowing that kindness creates the strongest communities, and that tradition is most beautiful when it serves love. The story of their wedding day became more than just a personal memory. It became a reminder that in times of difficulty and restriction, human kindness can create celebrations more meaningful than any that money can buy. It proved that protocol and rules serve their highest purpose when they make space for compassion and community. And it demonstrated that sometimes the most beautiful traditions are the ones that emerge spontaneously when people choose to care for each other. In the end, David and Christina's wedding day showed that love doesn't require perfect circumstances. It requires people willing to recognize it, celebrate it, and support it wherever they find it. Their story became a testament to the power of community, the beauty of tradition, and the magic that happens when a man in uniform chooses to serve joy as faithfully as he serves duty.